this is Claudia Goldin, and it is August 5th,
Yeah.
right? And I'm in my Littauer office with Gary Becker of the University of Chicago and with my friend Larry Katz. And we're going to talk...
Of Harvard University.
What?
Yeah.
Of Harvard
And the year's
University.
2003.
And the...
Sure.
What?
And the year's 2003 to make sure we get it all
2003.
documented.
And we're going to talk with Gary about, mainly about the Bureau, but he can meander to whatever he wants. So you were talking about something having to do with the history of the Bureau. You said something about, the history of the Bureau up until, so why don't you continue that?
Up until it left
Yeah.
New York, and I think John Meyer moved it to New Haven for a while, and then
Right.
eventually to Cambridge. But I first became familiar with the Bureau through Milton Friedman when I was a graduate student, so I knew a lot about the Bureau, for a graduate student anyway, while I was at Chicago, and its great empirical tradition, which the Bureau was. I mean, Burns and Mitchell were basically anti-theoretical, even though Burns taught a course at Columbia on theory, but he taught it in the form of, look at these assumptions in a negative fashion, and it turned people off of theory, even though Burns himself was a competent theorist and a Marshallian type theorist. So the Bureau developed a strong tradition by the time I came there of very empirical, very careful work, which was not the standards of the profession at that time, which was largely non-empirical, or if it was empirical, it was sloppy empirical. The NBER always had, if you had a research assistant and they had to compile data, they would have another research assistant who would be looking at the data, and the other person would be reading out. It was a very careful procedure to make sure of accuracy. And as I say, I think of one thing at the Bureau in those days, it was a great emphasis on quantitative work that was accurate, that you could trust. And I always would say any number that Jeffrey Moore, for example, ever told me, I would have 100% confidence in that number. He wouldn't give a number unless he had checked it very carefully. But the downside of that, from my perspective, was there was kind of an anti-theoretical orientation at the Bureau, and that eventually began to change. Maybe I'll stop here. Maybe you have something you want to direct me to. I could go on.
I guess the question on that point would be, obviously the person who linked the theoretical and the empirical and in Bureau projects was Milton Friedman. Your advisor was the fact that he was Chicago and not that involved their day-to-day meant he didn't affect what actually happened at NBER, because clearly his projects, from income from independent professional practice to monetary history, clearly combined the two.
Yeah, his income from independent professional practice, as you know, I don't know if you know the history of that. That started out as a study by Simon Kuznets with some data on doctors' earnings from 29 through 33, I think, approximately. Milton Friedman then was brought in, and it became his doctoral dissertation. And you can see, even in the introduction to the independent, in the book, they say what Friedman did and what Kuznets did. And Friedman brought into the study a lot of analytical techniques, and particularly I would say two things in particular. It was a human capital analysis, so he looked at discounted earnings, and he introduced the permanent transitory distinction, which started there, and then he applied it to the consumption function. But it started so I always thought the study on income for independent professional practice was perhaps the greatest empirical study of its time, in the sense that it was careful empirical and it had an analytical analysis. And it was a great book. I mean, it was terribly reviewed in the American Economic Review. I once checked that when I wrote an essay about Friedman. Why waste your time on this little problem was a basic reviewer. So it never got the reception that it deserved. But to me, reading it as a graduate student. I always thought it was a great book, and I think it stands as really a great book for anybody who comes across it now. But as you said, Larry, he combined theory and empirical in not only in that book, but to some extent in his monetary history with Anna Schwartz. Anna was the more empirical person. She was a very careful worker, knew monetary history very well. Milton really, until very late, didn't really know monetary history that well. I mean, he learned it in the course of doing it. Anna knew more.
I think Anna learned it in the course of doing it.
Yeah.
I think that there was this magic moment when they thought they finished the book, brought it to Princeton, had it read by someone, and the person said, this could be a monetary history. And then Anna went and got out of the library, hundreds of books, read them, summarized them.
Yeah, it could be. I don't. You would know that better than I do. But she eventually knew more monetary history than Milton. But Milton learned a fair amount, and I think partly indirectly through Anna, really, and maybe partly on his own reason. But when I came to the Bureau, the way I came to the Bureau, that might be relevant. I was thinking of, I didn't have a lot of offers. I had one from Columbia. I mean, I wanted to be on the East Coast. I really only had Columbia. Columbia made me an offer.
This is in 56, 57.
I think I went there in 57. I'd
And
been an
you're
assistant
at
professor at Chicago for 3 years, and Chicago actually offered me more money to stay. But I wanted to leave Chicago to get on my own more. And so I wanted to be on the East Coast for various family reasons, and it wasn't a huge market. I mean, Johns Hopkins I interviewed with, they decided not to make me an offer, but Columbia did. And then I, sort of through my Milton connection with Milton, the National Bureau came in, and I said I would like to be connected with the National Bureau. It was important to me as part of Columbia. And they asked me what I would like to work on. And I said I'd like to work on calculating the rates of return on education. I mean, so what I suggested was a very empirical project. And Saul Fabricant, who was then director of research, went out and raised $37,500 from the Carnegie Corporation, with John Gardner, I don't know if you know that name, was then head of the Carnegie Corporation. He was always very proud that he supported this early study. It was a very small grant, but it was just for me and a research assistant. They gave me $3,000 a year as salary. And I started out entirely as an empirical study. At Chicago, Ted Schultz was working on human capital, so human capital was known. There was some work by some others going on, but I thought the empirical work on that had not really been done carefully enough in terms of estimating the return. So I started getting data and thinking about it. And the more I began to think about the problem, the more it occurred to me that it offered a fairly unified way of understanding a lot of labor market issues. And so I began to think of on-the-job, not only the role of education in earnings, but also on-the-job training, general and specific training, who paid for the training is an issue I got into. That's stuff from the military, the consequences for inequality, a lot of theoretical issues that I could see it opened up, that this approach opened up. So I altered the project. I still had for me at least, a big empirical section on, on estimating the rate of return. The first half of the book was basically theory, and then the second half of the book, was testing the theory, but mainly it was empirical that had some relation to the theory, because a lot of the on-the-job stuff I didn't try to test. It took a long time before we began, and we still don't know that much about it. But I did do a lot of work on the empirical side, and the first paper I reported out on that book, Arthur Burns asked me to present a paper at a meeting of the American Economic Association on some of the empirical results, which I did do. And it was eventually published in the proceedings, called Underinvestment in Education, ? And I made calculations of the rate of return on education and compared it with some data that Stigler had put together for the National Bureau on rate of return on physical capital. And I concluded there was no obvious evidence that there was underinvestment in education. I looked at the externalities issue some, tried to make some calculations of what it could be, and if there were these externalities, what would be, where they would be. So I did a little work on that at the time, mainly again empirical, but a little bit of a theory. And then we had this, and I got encouraged. I wasn't discouraged from working on the theory, even though the Bureau. Let me give you a little more about the Bureau. When I would go to the Bureau certainly every Friday, and often in second day a week. I would only go to Columbia like 3 days a week. I lived out in the suburbs, and I would go at least one day and often 2 days to the Bureau. So I got to know everybody at the Bureau.
The Bureau was at Columbus Circle?
The Bureau was at 39th and Madison.
Uh-huh.
I don't know what that's. No, that wasn't Columbus
No.
Circle. No, the Columbus Circle was the original.
Right.
No, eventually they moved into this fancy office building. They had, I think it was the 11th floor. They had one whole floor of an office building. It was just an office building, really. And they rented. They had a very good long-term rental contract. So from my perspective, it was good. I would take the train. You could take the train from the suburbs. I was living in Scarsdale. And you'd be at Grand Central, you'd be very close to the Bureau. So I would go in a lot, got to know the people there, interacted with some of them very closely.
So which people
What I interacted with? Well, of course, it depends. I mean, the years are a little bit merged in my head. But the people I was close with was Jacob Mincer. He spent 1 year, while I first came to Bureau, he spent a year at Chicago as a postdoc. Schultz bargained with him too tightly, and he decided not to take. He was offered a Chicago assistant professor, decided to come back to New York, where his wife had a good position at Montefiore Hospital. And so he and I would interact a lot. Even when he was at City College, and we brought him into Columbia, we interacted even more. We ran a workshop together. It was a really very good workshop, and we were at the Bureau together. So. We never published anything together, although we did. But we did do a paper together, which we should have published. Really, it was kind of a perfect, kind of rational expectations model of the consumption function, but limited by the assumption of perfect certainty, that people could look ahead and then have.
So perfect foresight.
A perfect foresight model of consumption. And I was a little bit bothered that we didn't quite get the timing right, so we put it aside, but we should have published the paper. It was a really quite, as I look at it in retrospect, a very good paper. That was the only thing we ever did together, but we indirectly.
Jacob told me a little bit about
Pardon
it.
me?
Jacob told me
did.
a little bit about
okay.
it. He said that you divided it up. Now, you must have both been in New York at the time, but somehow
We were both in New York.
he
both in
mailed
Columbia.
you a copy. And maybe the mails weren't working very well.
Can't remember.
Yeah.
I can't remember. Not too long ago, I had found a copy. No, it was something we certainly we should have published. It would have been a good.
But then
paper.
Bob Hall published
Bob,
it.
yeah, and he had uncertainty in it and so on. But basically, it was the same sort of thing. With people make uncertainty is relevant, of course, for these problems. But a lot of the rational expectation stuff, you get the essence out of it in perfectly certain situations. The uncertainty adds interesting questions because the world is not perfectly certain and things don't fully explain anyway. That's what we had. So we never wrote anything, but we interacted a lot. Victor Fuchs, when I first met Victor Fuchs, I mean, he was teaching at General Studies. He seemed like he was a Columbia PhD. He seemed like one of these big, nice guys who, I mean, I didn't take very seriously, to tell you the truth. But I liked him. I mean, he was a nice person. And then he went to the Ford Foundation for 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And usually you get ruined by going to a foundation. But he came back much better than ever. I mean, he went to the Ford Foundation not as a research fellow, but as a program officer. That's what he was doing. But it led him to think about a lot of problems, health and so on.
Right.
And he came back as a ball of fire after that. He had a lot of ideas, brimming with ideas. Yeah. So he and I began to interact a great deal. Then I got some money, I don't remember how. I brought in some education fellows for a year. Sherwin came in for a year, got to know him. Albert Fischel, you wouldn't think of associating him with it, but he came in He was working on 19th century education at the time, so, I brought him in, and I interacted with him a lot, and I'm still on good terms with Albert, although his interests have shifted. Sri Grillagas came in on a different sort of fellowship for a year, so I interacted with him closely.
So this is in the early 60s.
This was in the 60s, yeah, I can't remember the
Mm-hmm.
time. I came to the Bureau from 57, and I left around 69 in terms of
Mm-hmm.
physically, and so it took place over that period.
Right.
Sherwin probably came in the early 60s to the Bureau. Svi came I think in the early 60s. We made Svi an offer at Columbia, but he decided to go back to Chicago. He didn't accept it. Rosen went back to Rochester. Rosen was going nowhere at Rochester. They were about to dump him. This might be relevant for your study, because his work at the National Bureau really got him excited. He did this book with Nethery on dynamic models of the labor market. Maybe it wasn't great, but it was for that time it was innovative. Had a lot of other ideas. So he went back to Rochester, brimming with ideas, and eventually, he became one of their stars and in the profession, and they made him a chaired professor and so on. But he was very close to being thrown out of Rochester. His work was going slowly. So Sherwin was a slow, deep thinker. And the Bureau was a great period for him. He always said that was a great period for him. And he came to our workshop. I think I had a big influence on him at that time. And gradually the Bureau began to change a little, very little. I proposed to Arthur Burns, and sometime in the early 60s, we started a program in law and economics, or mid-60s. He turned me down. Now, Arthur Burns, you asked me somewhere about Arthur Burns. He was like a mentor to me. He liked me a lot. He gave me good advice. He socially invited us to his house, and he came to our house. And when you went in to see Arthur Burns, it was like going into a black hole. You were there for an hour and a half or so. He loved to talk and so on. And, sometimes I'd be trying to catch a train to go back, and he'd be talking and talking. But he was an important influence on me. I liked Arthur a lot. He was a very smart man. And he was very sympathetic to my work, but he didn't want the Bureau. He had the old conception of the Bureau. Stay within your confines. He was not somebody who saw any view of expanding economics, what the Bureau would deal with. So while he was quite receptive to the human capital work, he could see that, but the law and economics stuff he turned down. We did eventually get, I think, the first law and economics program anywhere in the world, which I did start. And I brought in two major people on it, Bill Landis and Dick Posner, and they were both connected with the National Bureau of Law and Economics project. And we had other people. Isaac Ehrlich was a graduate student who worked on it.
So how did you manage to do this, given that Burns was against
Well,
it?
he was first against it. We came back again with now Fuchs supporting it, and they changed their mind. Exactly why I can't. I don't know what went on in Burns' mind. Maybe he could see that this was a field rising. He became more convinced of it. We had Fuchs who wanted to do health economics. We started maybe the first major health economics project. Not me, Victor. It was Victor who started that, and had, I think, a very dynamic project going on there on health economics. And eventually we put it together in a center for I forgot what it was called, economic and social something. That Victor Fuchs became the first director of it. Had Victor, me, Jacob, Bill Landis, Dick Posner, Finest Well. I had a great collection of people in it who all had some affiliation with the Bureau. Some of them through the graduate program at City University, where Victor finally went, where Finest Welch went, where Landis went, Mike Grossman came, Jim Smith. They had a couple of other people. It really was a top group for about 4 or 5 years when it completely disintegrated. But at one time, they had a really outstanding group of people, all of whom pretty much were connected with the NBER. And the Graduate Center was located on 42nd Street,
near the
near some old department store or something. I don't remember what they took over. They took over some building.
Uh-huh.
You might know better, but it was some building they took over. It was very close to the NBER, which was 39th and Madison. They were 42nd, around 5th and 6th, I don't remember where. So it would be easy for them to come over. It was much harder to come from Columbia down, but occasionally I would do both on the same day and take a taxi down from Columbia to the Bureau. Well, I can go on, but maybe you have something specific
No,
you want me.
I think going on is very good. We talked about a lot of the people that you spoke with at the Bureau. Finus, for example. So Finus was around there quite a bit.
He was around,
And,
yeah. Toward the end of my stay there, but he was around, yeah, definitely.
Right, and of course Victor and others.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was this group of people whom you brought in through this raising of some funds, like Sherwin.
Yeah, we had
and
some, I
others.
forgot how we got them, but we had some postdoc funds, yeah.
Right,
Exactly.
and that was very good. And occasionally you would talk to Burns, and Burns was very supportive of the human capital stuff. Much of the Bureau at New York was involved in the business cycle research stuff, but they were sort of separate, and you didn't really talk to them. They were
No,
often
when I came, well, pretty much all the Bureau was a business
Right.
cycle stuff. Pretty much all.
right.
No, I knew them all, and I would interact with some of them.
Remember Ruth Mack?
Of course, I knew
Yeah.
Ruth Mack, yeah. She had done an early study, was it on inventories, I think? I think so.
Boots and shoes and leather and
Yeah,
hides.
right, yeah. No, I knew Ruth Mack very well.
Uh-huh.
She would come in. She had a little independent income, so she was kind of well-to-do. She would come in. I knew her very well. I would interact with her.
Mm-hmm.
She was very empirical.
Right.
Very empirical. I mean, she didn't. There were a bunch of people I would say didn't really know economics in any solid way. Thor Hultgren. You may never even have heard of Thor
No,
Hultgren.
I've heard of Hultgren.
I mean, very empirical. Thor
Uh-huh.
Hultgren was also. The Bureau is a great place for misfits. Thor Hultgren, as a person, was a misfit. He couldn't communicate, couldn't interact with people, but he was great for the Bureau. And the great thing about the Bureau was, and I think it has to be said, was the Bureau was willing to hire minorities of all types. Jews, they gave a place for a lot of Jews. Arthur Burns was Jewish, and Wesley Mitchell was a very fair-minded person, and he didn't care what your background was, so a lot of Jews found employment at the National Bureau. Saul Fabricant, who was director of research when I was there, and it was a very good guy. I liked Saul a lot.
Simon.
Pardon me? Simon, of course, yeah. He was already at Pennsylvania when I was
Right.
there, but he would come in, so I got to know him a little bit. I can't say very well, and I had one little run-in with him that he wasn't happy about, which
Right.
we can go into in a moment.
Right.
Yeah, which I'll mention. I knew, of course, I knew his work and had a lot of respect for him. Milton told me some about him and from the Bureau, and he would come in occasionally, but I didn't interact. Ray Goldsmith, you know that name?
Oh yeah, I know Ray.
The wealth stuff.
Well, I knew Ray.
He came in a lot, so I got to know him pretty well.
Right.
He was doing these wealth
Right.
estimates.
And I
knew
guess
him.
the other person who I don't know where he was, but who published a book, at least during your period, that seems to possibly be related was Clarence Long.
Right.
Clarence Long, yeah, I knew him slightly because he may have been working. He eventually became a member of the
Right,
House of
of the
Representatives, right, and left academia. But I knew his book and I knew him. I don't remember if he. I think he started his book quite a bit before I actually got there. It may have come out
It came out in
publication.
60 or so.
Yeah, but it had a long gestation period. And so he was working on that, and I knew about his work. I had read much of his book, and I thought it was very interesting. And I think it had an influence on Jacob, who, is Jacob's famous
Enormous
paper.
influence, yeah. Because when Jacob said that when he went to Chicago, Al Reese, he took Al and Greg's labor force,
Mhm.
because when Jacob arrived at Chicago, they declared that he was a labor economist, and he said, but I don't know any labor, and considered it an insult anyhow, he said. So he
it was insulting
Yeah.
in those days.
but not at Chicago.
Well,
So-
I'll tell you a story about that
Yeah,
too.
so-
You might be interested.
So
in.
he took their courses, and Al Reese spent much of a semester talking about Clarence Long's work.
Oh, did he? Okay.
And he and Greg, maybe this was in a workshop, because the way Jacob tells it is he and Greg, Al and Greg would debate, well, how could this be? How could we resolve this? And Jacob said that this was one of the magical moments of his life when he said, "Oh, I can resolve it."
Could be. I don't know. I wasn't there at the
Yeah,
time.
right.
Yeah, but certainly there were people at Chicago familiar. Well, because Margaret Reed's doctoral dissertation dealt with household production in an important way. It was really an unsung book, I think. It was a good book in a lot of ways. But if you look, labor, let me just tell you this very briefly, this story about labor economics in Chicago. When I came to Chicago, I'd come from Princeton, which had a industrial relations tradition, Richard Lester,
Right.
Mainly, who I liked a lot, but was very empirical, which was good because most of the profession wasn't empirical, but didn't really know a heck of a lot of economics, I would say, but did these empirical studies of whether workers got their marginal product, things of that type, which I think were valuable in the profession, although they didn't get a lot of credit. But anyway, labor economics at Princeton, all the worst students went into labor economics, so I didn't take any labor economics courses. Even when I came to Chicago, I sat in on Greg's course. I didn't take it, but I did sit in on it religiously, and I began to see that it was a very important course for me because it was analytical as well as empirical as a combination. But when I was in my second or third year, Al Reese came to me, and I started work on discrimination. He said, "Well, Gary, we in the Industrial Relations Center would like to offer you a fellowship." I'd had a fellowship. He said, "We'd like to offer you another fellowship because you're now working in labor economics." I said to him, I got really upset. I said, "Look, I'm not working in labor economics." I did tell him that. I said, "I'm working in applied price theory." Al was very nice. I mean, what I said was stupid. Al was nice. He said, "Whatever you want to call it, we're willing to hold it." So it turned out when I went to Columbia, I was replacing Leo Woolman teaching labor economics, which I did do for one or 2 years only. And then Jacob came and did it, and I didn't teach it any longer. But at the Bureau, what I began to see, I knew all these people: Thor Hultgren, C. Harry Kahn, Ruth Mack,
Victor
Anna
Zarnowitz.
Schwartz, Victor Zarnowitz, knew him very well. Anybody you can mention who was at the Bureau, I knew him well because I'd go in a lot and I'd go to all the seminars, I'd go around. Sure, I knew them all. And I was on good terms with all of them. And my first seminar I gave at the Bureau on my own work, I made it very, very empirical. And I thought it was a poor seminar because I felt I wasn't doing my comparative advantage, to talk about this. And they weren't that interested. They started telling me, "Well, what are some of the bigger issues you're talking about?" Which was what I was interested in. So after that, I learned my lesson, and I spoke what I wanted to. But the Bureau was very empirical, had some very good people, very careful, as I said. But for my taste, not enough analysis. And so I began to push, as I got increasing influence, in more analysis. So on the first philanthropy study they had with Frank Dickinson, which was very empirical, I wrote a little paper on how to look upon this from a theoretical point of view with altruism and things of that type. And when they had any other areas, I say, well, look at the theory of this. In my own work, I began to report on some of the theoretical aspects, and I found these people were interested in that, even though they were highly empirical. So the Bureau maintained its strong empirical bent while it was in New York, but it gradually also began to allow more theory. It was still measurement and so on, careful measurement, but more theory was involved. They approved the Law and Economics Project. They improved the center that Victor headed up. Not only approved it, they thought it was good for the Bureau. So we began to, and the business cycle stuff began to become of relatively less importance at the Bureau. Still you had these people working on it, It was still important, but its expansion was in other areas. It's not so much they contracted that work, but they began to expand in these other areas. So from a relative point of view, became definitely less important.
So I guess I have a question about a couple of projects in the Bureau that seem. There's this 1960 volume in which your first, at least what I think of as the first paper on the economic theory of fertility,
Oh yeah.
comes in. What's the story of that volume and your involvement in it? And was that done separately, or was it part of a Bureau project?
My paper was not really officially part of any Bureau project. I had no fertility project at the Bureau. It's something I was actually, when I came and suggested I work on human capital for the Bureau, to me this was just a project to get the Bureau to support it. My first interest at that time was fertility and population. Of course, I stayed interested in that problem, but I gradually became really interested in human capital. It was sort of a way to earn money and be connected with the Bureau. So the fertility stuff I did on my own. Now, it was one of these Bureau conference volumes, but a Bureau conference volume had a different type of life than a regular Bureau volume. A regular Bureau volume, was done at the Bureau. You had to go through this difficult Bureau process, which held up the income from independent professional practices for several years because of this one board member who didn't like the conclusions about the medical profession. It held up George Stigler's work on engineers because of some work and so on. But he had to go through a good process, a difficult process. The conference volumes were of a different nature. And so I don't remember how I got into doing this, but I did this paper on fertility, which the conference was held at Princeton, actually, not physically at the NBER. I went down to Princeton, and the paper was not well received. I mean, it was attacked a lot by Dusenberry, who was my discussant, by most of the audience, and I had two defenders, Friedman and Kuznets. I'm pretty sure Kuznets was at that conference. I know they defended that this wasn't stupid, and so on, was worth doing. But everybody else, the economists as well as sociologists, were very much opposed to it. I wouldn't identify that with a Bureau project. I may have done it on Bureau. I didn't keep track carefully, but it was never officially sponsored by the Bureau. None of my population work was ever officially sponsored by the Bureau, though it came out in this NBER conference.
And then there's this, in 62, this amazing JPE issue where your work on human capital, Jacobs, George Stigler's sort of human capital approach to thinking about information in the labor market, Shostad's paper on migration, which is a Bureau, it's listed as a Bureau, something linked to the Bureau. What was the story?
It may be, but I would say I would give credit for that more to wasn't Ted Schultz the editor?
Yeah, he was
I would give him the credit for putting it together. It was not it may have been some Bureau connection, but again, it was not a Bureau project.
Was it a university's national
I think it was
Bureau?
the university's.
One of the universities.
I know it has an NBER.
That's what it was. One of the universities. Those were done differently. Yeah, my work was real Bureau work. Jacob's work was real Bureau work. Jacob got interested in that through our workshop, really, and I presented some of the theory, and he saw how to get some measurements out of it, so he had this important paper there. Shostad's work on migration had nothing to do with the Bureau. George Stigler's work on information, he never, as far as I know, published any of that really for the Bureau. That was independent work that he did at Chicago. Selma Mushkin had some work on health, which is not a Bureau work, but I would give Ted a lot of credit for putting that volume together. And it was not officially a Bureau volume, although it is in this university's NBER. So the Bureau had to, be willing to go along with it in some sense, but I wouldn't call
Research
that.
Conference are other people.
Yeah. But a good fraction of that volume was Bureau work. Me and Mintzer. You look at pages, probably we're close to half that volume.
Yes.
Something like that. So it was, in that sense, an important part. But it was Ted Schultz. I was in constant communication with Ted when I was doing my human capital stuff. We had a lot of interaction back and forth, and I got a lot out of Ted. I gave a couple of reports in Chicago. Ted was unhappy with my first paper on underinvestment in claiming there wasn't any obvious evidence of underinvestment in human capital. He said, "Oh, you know, you're just trying to be too free, Mark." I never saw Ted get annoyed. I never saw Ted get annoyed at me. He really, Ted, always, I was one of his fair-haired boys. He treated me very well. And I wrote him back, "Look, Ted," I said, "this is what the evidence looks like. I don't feel I'm biasing in any way. If you can show me any way where it's biased, I'll be glad to change it." And he eventually bought a lot of it, but his initial reaction was very negative. But Ted Schultz was very important. For me, for that volume, clearly he put it together. While he was not connected with the Bureau, as I said, me, and to a lesser extent Jacob, but I was in very close contact with Ted Schultz over that whole period of time.
Now, George was at the Bureau at the same time, right? So.
Well, yes and no. George was one of the reasons I came to Columbia. I didn't have any other office, but so I didn't have a big choice.
Oh, you had the Chicago.
At Chicago. Yeah, Chicago. But I wanted to leave Chicago. Although if I had no office, I would have stayed at Chicago. But one of the reasons was George Stiglitz being there, because I didn't know him well, but through Milton, I'd known him. George, I sent George a copy of my discrimination work, and he gave me one useful piece of advice, which I did follow, an important piece of advice. But I admired him a lot, and I wanted to, he was the big attraction. Well, he happened to be on leave when I came to Columbia at the center, and he never came back to Columbia. He went from the center to Chicago. I remember I wrote him a letter, maybe a little bit on the presumptuous side. I spoke to him about it later. I said, "Look, George, if you come back to Columbia, I will stay at Columbia." Well, he eventually told me, this is maybe off the record because it's tooting my own horn a little bit, I don't want to but that if he had known how important I would become, he might have come back. So I don't think it had any influence on him. Columbia made a terrible mistake in bargaining with him, as Columbia made many mistakes. And I think his inclination was to come back, but he got a very good offer from Chicago, and he would have been willing to accept less money from Columbia, but they kind of insulted him in a way, and he didn't come back. So I never interacted with him. So from that point on, he had maybe for a while a Bureau connection, but a distant Bureau connection. He was affiliated, I'm sure, for several years subsequently, maybe many years, I don't remember, but he didn't come in physically very much. I corresponded with him. I knew him, and I would send him a lot of my stuff, and he would send me comments on it, but not because I physically interacted with him much in New York. Only very occasionally would he be in, or would Milton be in. Milton would come in very occasionally to talk about the monetary history with Anna, but he wasn't in very much.
Summers.
A little bit in the summer, but he'd go to New Hampshire, and he'd come in, so he wouldn't be around a lot. When he was around, I usually met him because he was, although Greg was my chairman of my committee, and I was very close. Greg and Milton were the two people I was closest to, so I was very close to Milton, and so I would make an effort to see him, and he would see me when he came in. He visited Columbia in '64. We tried to get him to stay. He thought about it seriously, but decided not to stay and went back to Chicago at that time. So he spent a whole year in New York, and then he was at Columbia more during that year.
What about students, Columbia students working at as research assistants? So the Bureau always had this tradition of having research assistants who were, many of whom were not graduate students. They were just smart undergraduates who came on and went to graduate school later. But this was it seems to me that this was, and tell me if this is the case, a new transition in which you had your graduate students who were working on their dissertations, working at the Bureau, rather than people like Bob Lipsig, for example, who was a Columbia graduate student, but he needed full-time money, so he was working at the Bureau.
Yeah, became full-time at the Bureau. Yes, I don't know if I started the tradition, but I certainly was one of the prime pushers. I thought it was great for graduate students to be connected with the Bureau, to get involved in a project, and sometimes they could get their thesis out of it, or it would be related to their thesis, or just be an interesting project. So I began to bring pretty much all my top graduate students into work at the Bureau. I was able to get them positions. So if you think of the students I had, pretty much all of them: Isaac Ehrlich, Gilbert Gez, Mike Grossman, Bob Michael, Bill Landis, Barry Chiswick. I mean, all these people, I'm pretty sure maybe I'm making, and some others worked at the National Bureau, and some others.
A number of them had major Bureau books.
And some of them came out with major Bureau books, like Bob Michael and Mike Grossman each published these monographs, which were really extensions of their dissertations. Mike's stuff on health capital was his dissertation at Columbia, which he did partly at the Bureau, and Bob's study on productivity in the household sector was his dissertation at Columbia. Isaac, in his law and economics book that Landis and I edited for the Bureau, Isaac had one of his papers in there, so he definitely worked at the Bureau. Gez and I, the book we did, I don't know, was it a Bureau book?
I think it's a Bureau
Yeah, I
book
think
on
it's a
fish
Bureau
oil.
book, yeah. He worked at the Bureau. Gez was actually, he's one of the unfortunate cases. He was one of the top students of his cohort, and he just never, he had too many mental problems. He just never made it, but he was a really good student, and he was there. Arlene Leibowitz worked at the Bureau. I'm sure a bunch of others, but we did that. Jacob did it too, and Arthur Burns never really did it. He didn't have any graduate students when I was there to speak of. So yeah, we began to do that, and it was great for the graduate students. It was a great experience for them, and it was good to get good research assistants. And in the areas where we were working, instead of getting these outside undergraduates, my first assistant at my education human capital study was just a smart young girl who was a graduate of one of the 7 women's colleges. Didn't know any economics, but she was a good assistant to me. And that was the tradition. Then you got these people, and some of whom, some of the research assistants were 65 years old. If you look at the people working around at the Bureau, there'd be these old people, a lot of women. Bureau was an employer of women when women couldn't get good jobs. So again, as hiring of minorities, one of the important things that we said about the Bureau was they hired women, and not just in research assistants. You mentioned Ruth Mack, Anna Schwartz, and there were other women who were regular researchers at the Bureau. But there were a lot of older women who were working there, many of whom I got to know.
Edith Kuznets was a research assistant there, and that's how she met.
Yeah, it could be. I didn't know her. But
that was long before.
Gerhard Bree. Did you know the name Gerhard Bree? He wrote some empirical studies for the Bureau. You may not even know. He worked very much with Bree, and there was a woman, forgot her name now, who worked for years at the Bureau, who was a co-author. Was more than just a research assistant, became a co-author with him on that. So she was there a long time. Anna had some old-timers working for her, Victor Zanowitz. There were a lot of old-timers working there who had been around for years. I mean, many of them, as I said, could not fit in with a regular business-type organization. So the Bureau hired misfits. This may sound strange, but it was great for the Bureau. They were cheap, they were often good, and they, it gave them jobs, and it was good for the Bureau. So the Bureau, in that respect, I think was a very important organization. I think Wesley Mitchell set the tone on that. Wesley Mitchell was a very fair-minded, I didn't know Wesley Mitchell, but he was from everything I heard, very fair-minded, honest individual, and he was willing to hire anybody who was good.
And his wife was an accomplished.
She was accomplished.
Individual.
Yeah. I once read a biography of the Mitchells, and she actually, I think, had a little money even, maybe, and Wesley Mitchell got his PhD from the University of Chicago. Was one of the first PhD students at the University of Chicago. Wrote a very good study on greenbacks during the Civil War. A very important empirical study. And so he was very important. I mean, other people like Milton will know a lot more about Mitchell than I would.
Right.
But he was. But I said he set this tone of non-discrimination, hiring the best people you could get, and that meant a lot of Jews, women, and a lot of people who were oddballs who could work at the Bureau, but they couldn't fit into a regular type of organization.
Right. Did you notice in the mid-'60s that there was any dissent about Arthur? I mean, something did happen in the 60s that led to the change, and Arthur had these various opportunities to, to be an ambassador, for example.
I know a little bit about that.
Yeah.
There was a lot of unhappiness at the Bureau when Arthur accepted the chairmanship of the Council of Economic Advisors under Eisenhower. That was his first move out. I think he accepted that before I came to the Bureau, but he was there when I came to the Bureau because I went down to Washington. He offered me a position on the council, but he said if he was me, he wouldn't take that. He would become an academic, go to Columbia when I had a Columbia offer. He said, if I was you, I would take the Columbia offer. I think you'll do better in that offer. So he was away at the time. He came back to the Bureau, and he became the president, a new title they created for him, president. And he was clearly the boss. I mean, he is the strongest personality, strongest mind compared to people like Moore and Fabricant. He was just more able and more forceful than they were. But then he began, and he for a while, starting like when he came back, I don't know, 58, I don't remember. So the next 7 years, he was very important, exercising. I said he turned down the law and economics. He pushed the study of the Soviet economy by Nutter, and we had a meeting about it, and I opposed it. I said, it's too far removed from what our competence in, and I said, so why should we be going into this? And Burns, the Rockefeller brothers, I think, were the ones financing it, and that he said it, and so, I mean, my opposition to me, I mean, it wasn't a vote, other people opposed it, but he decided to go, and I think in retrospect he was right. I think it was an important study, because even though Nutter didn't know Russian, I think he put together Gail Johnson, Arcadius Kahan, and other people who were active in it, and I think they were much closer to the truth than a lot of the estimates that were being made about growth and so on. So I think that was an important study. But he exercised a very strong will. But then he began to tire of it. He began to get more in politics, and they were then looking for a new director. And there was nobody natural within the New York office. He may have asked me, I think he did, and I said I wasn't interested in becoming director. I think they asked George Stigler, and Stigler thought about it for a while, and I think he would have accepted it if it had been the right terms. I don't know the history of that 100%, but eventually he wanted to do something like that, Stigler, but eventually he turned it down, and then maybe they never even made him an official offer. So they had nobody to do it. That's when they brought John Meyer in.
So what year was?
66.
Well, you would know the
67,
year, but and Meyer, I never thought he was a good. Again, this is off the record. I never thought he was a good head of the Bureau. He would come in. He was then at Yale, I believe. He would come in, and I don't think he knew what direction he wanted it to go in, and so on. He didn't bother our center. He supported us, but I didn't think he was good. On the other hand, I saw the problem. There was no natural person in the New York office who could head up the Bureau. But so was there unhappiness with Arthur? I don't know. He dominated everybody. There was no room for I mean, I don't know what Saul Fabricant and Jeffrey Moore thought of Arthur, but they worshipped him. People like me and Jacob and Victor. Well, Arthur wasn't bothering us, so we continued to do and have increasing influence on what was being done. And eventually Arthur kind of, pulled himself out. He was not happy with the choice of Maya when it eventually worked out. He was not happy the way Maya worked out. I know that because he had told me that. But he began to take a lesser and lesser.
I think he went.
influence.
I said ambassador. He went to the board at that point.
He went to the board.
Yeah.
He became ambassador much
Later.
later.
Right after he was on the Federal Reserve
Yeah,
Board, he
much
became
later, ambassador
to
German. But that was much
Yeah.
later. So when he was on the board, of course, he may have asked the Bureau to prepare some numbers for him, as some other government agencies did. Leading indicators were the Bureau. The Bureau started leading indicators. Jeffrey Moore and Arthur Burns really started it, and then Jeffrey Moore took it over. And then eventually the government took over what the Bureau had pioneered.
Eventually the government privatized it.
Yeah, eventually privatized it again, exactly. So he may have asked the Bureau to, compute various numbers for him when he was chairman, but that I don't know. I wasn't involved in that. So was there an unhappiness with Arthur? Probably, but that I don't think played a role in any of these type of decisions. He dominated the board. He dominated everybody around there, and he was Arthur Burns. Probably never knew him. Was a very forceful.
I did know him.
Oh, you did? No.
Late in his life,
Oh.
and I was charmed by Arthur, and I was told that all women are charmed by Arthur, and men are dominated
Yeah.
by him.
Well, he had a very strong personality. He once told me, again, I don't know if this should be for public statement, that when he went to Washington, he said he felt he said there were a lot of economists in Washington. How did he do? He said he felt he could tie one hand behind his back and handle all the economists that were there. And he did. He was a very important, when he was with the council and so on, he had and at the Federal Reserve, he dominated the Washington government economic scene. So he was a very strong person, very smart. I had a lot of respect for Arthur Burns. And the only things I was down on him about, he was too anti-theory. I think that was a mistake, and that's why he created that tradition at Columbia of the people he taught. And he had a too conventional view of what economics should be like. But to his credit, he eventually began to support our work. But otherwise, I was a big fan of Arthur Burns. Did we answer all the questions?
There was something you were going to come back to, but I forget what it is. About Kuznets?
Right.
What was it?
Oh, well, a
About
small
Kuznets,
thing,
yeah.
but it might be interesting. The Bureau had the policy. It was a policy. It wasn't just a tradition. It was a policy that if anybody submitted a manuscript, it would have to be read by 2 to 3 Bureau senior staff members. So Simon Kuznets submitted a manuscript on long-term investment. I mean, you would know what he did better, but there's something like that. And I was asked to read it as one of the 3 readers. I spent a lot of time reading it and wrote an 8-page report, and very critical of some of it. And I said, oh, well, he puts together some interesting data, but then he has the last chapter of speculation. I said there's absolutely no connection between the speculation and the data he compiled, and I tried to demonstrate that. Well, I said, while the speculation may be interesting, it gives the impressions it's following from his data collection, and there's no connection here. And I went through case by case, cited it, and I said, look, this is what he finds, this is what he's speculating about, how can you go from this to that? I said, so I think, I was then, this was early, I was still in my 20s, and I said, I think this thing has to be rewritten to do so. So I sent it into Arthur, and Arthur sent it on to Kuznets, and I heard from Arthur, Kuznets hit the ceiling, who's this young upstart? He was telling him what he should be doing, and so on. And I don't know how much changes he ever made. Kuznets was already an important economist, but how much he made. So I think Kuznets, when he first met me, kind of had after that, had a negative view. But eventually he and I began to be friendly, and we would always speak about things. And when he retired from Harvard, some occasion he was telling me how, don't retire, he said, he had to retire because those are the old rules.
Right.
You don't retire, he said, retirement is a real problem. You don't know what to do with half your time now. You're on committees and so on. Before, you can only do research a certain number of hours a day. I mean, I thought it was very good advice. Maybe I followed that advice in my own career. As long as you're active and so on as he was, I think retirement was not a good option for him. He should have continued as full-time. So I had good relations with Kuznets eventually, but I know he was very unhappy over this report. On the other hand, I think, in retrospect, my report was right. I mean, I think what the points I made were right, and I think there was a tendency sometimes in what Simon wrote to have a weak connection between some of, you might say, the theory or the speculations and the data side, and I think it was worth pointing that out in this Bureau volume. So, I mean, I wouldn't retract what I said. Maybe being young, I would have said it in a more tactful fashion now. But I think I think I was actually was right on that point. He eventually we had good relations. But no, I wouldn't say I was ever really close with him because he was at Penn and he went to Hopkins and he went to Harvard and he his coming into the Bureau became less and less frequent.
Right. I mean, in some sense, in some ironic sense, Simon was probably more theoretical than anyone at the Bureau until the mid-50s when you and Jacob
Absolutely.
came in.
He had a strong theoretical bent
That's right.
to him. He did a lot of interesting projects. He was interested in human capital. You read some of his stuff on growth.
Sure.
Interesting
one
human
of
capital
the
work.
big blow-ups at the Bureau, way before you arrived, was when he proposed to Burns to have a comparative economic growth project in 47, I think, when Burns just took over from Mitchell, and Burns said absolutely not. And Simon essentially leaves the Bureau in many ways.
Well, not only for that reason.
Yeah.
They were competitors
competitors
for the head, and
yeah.
Burns won out. And I think that was one of the reasons.
Right.
So it's the unspoken thing no one ever says.
Yeah, right.
Right.
But I think there's no question that was true, that there were
Yeah.
competitors for that position.
But there was an animus between the two of them that no one could put their finger on, but a true animus that is
There's
very
no question. I had one small experience about that.
We're going to run out of tape in the middle of this, but that's okay.
All right, well, this is not that important.
Yeah.
But you and Larry may be interested.
Yeah.
I was preparing a session for the American Economic Association on some topic, and Burns had asked me to prepare it, and Burns was then president of the association. And I suggested to Burns that I was going to invite Simon Kuznets. He said, well, yes, he'd be good for that, but if you invited him, he won't accept. He said, it's better that I give him a call and invite him because, you're just a young guy. And status is important to Kuznets. So he did call him, he did invite him, he did accept, and he was on it. So I read between the lines at that time from just the way Burns said, that there was something. And then I had heard about that they were competitors for Mitchell. So they were competitors. A lot of people are competitors in every profession when they're a comparable age. They were both foreign-born, came over as immigrants to this country, and so they had similar backgrounds in a lot of ways, although their paths diverged.
Let me turn this off now. Point. I'm sorry that Charlie had to leave because I think this is a point he would have made. Maybe Vicki will have something to say about it, which is that that there are spillovers from, however we want to think about corruption, there are spillovers from it to social relations. That if politicians are believed to be venal, if business is believed to be corrupt and venal, then what are people's relationships to each other? What are people's relationships to the state? Do they pay their taxes? Do they pick up